But thanks for coming. We're here for our monthly Diamond Story, sponsored by our SABR Women in Baseball Committee. We meet the first Saturday of every month at 10 a.m. Eastern to have a conversation with our special guest of that particular month. And so we are very glad to see everybody joining us. And looking forward to our next couple of months, just to give you a heads up. Our special guests will be Laura Harai from Great Britain, a player from Great Britain, and then Sherry Davis, the longtime announcer, will be our next two guests coming up. But today we're here to have a conversation with our friend, Melissa Ludtke, journalist, author. Most of you know her most recent work, Locker Room Talk. But there is, and while that is a huge part of this story, it's only one part of Melissa's whole story, though it is very much a reflection of, I think, her entire career and everything that you have done, Melissa. So welcome. We're so glad you're here with us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Great to
And
be here.
and and so I have one question to get. Oh, so real quick, just to remind everybody, if you would please keep yourself muted so that we give Melissa that opportunity, and you can use the chat for questions as we go along, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A as well. So I just wanted to remind everybody of that. So Melissa, as we get started, just a starting question for you, and that is, so sort of when and where did you discover your love of baseball? And related to that, growing up, who was your favorite player?
All right. So you gave me a little clue that we were going to do this. So I am going to right away turn to a slideshow that I threw together this morning from a variety of slideshows. Leslie and I were talking, and I've done a lot of talks, and I think a number of you here have heard me talk about my case in some detail. So we wanted to move past that. I'll touch on it just a tiny bit. But I thought it would be more fun for us all to kind of take a little look at the history of, women covering baseball. That's kind of where I am. I'm not a player of it. I'm a softball player, but not a baseball player. That was not something available in my time. So we can enter that in a second. But because Leslie gave me a heads up, she was going to ask about how I came to love baseball so much. I threw it in right now to the top of my slideshow. So let me go to share that. And okay, allow, share. Okay, so can you all see this? I'm going to put it on play from start. And I'm assuming you can all see this. Yes?
Yes, there he is. Yep,
Okay,
got it.
fabulous. Okay, so Leslie's question was, how did I fall in love with baseball? I have two slides and just a quick story. You'll see here that this is from May 31st, 1951, and it's a paragraph that is very high up in a letter that my grandfather wrote to his daughter, with whom he had shared the experience of Fenway Park and the love of the Red Sox when she was a teenager growing up. And when she gave birth to me on May 27th of 1951, she was away in Iowa. And back then that meant that, of course, she couldn't hear the Red Sox games. She wasn't in a situation where she was going to read about them in any newspaper. And so when my grandfather decided to put a piece of paper into his typewriter and write to her 4 days after my birth, it just so happened that the Red Sox and Yankees had just finished their first 3 game, stretch at Fenway Park. And, in the beginning of the letter, he spells my name wrong, assures my mother that I will be a smart girl, and then rapidly gets to this paragraph, which I will let you all read. But it's really a rat-a-tat-tat summary of the games to his the one daughter out of 4 children who fell in love with baseball as he did and would watch it with him. What you see with my mom and what she gave me, which is maybe the most cherished gift that I still have, really sums up sort of the love she took of the game from her father. So I really talk about my love of the game in my book coming straight from the DNA, of my family, literally at the time of my birth in Iowa. And that it was transmitted when I found that letter from my grandfather after my mother had died as I was writing the book, and I found the letter in the pile of letters that she had kept. Being the first child in a family of five is the best because they keep everything. By the time they get to the fifth child, not so much. So I had, my little locks of hair. I had everything was collected in there. And I opened up this envelope and found that letter. And I just realized then how baseball was in me from the moment of birth. But I later discovered that my mom had these collections of what at the time were the spring training photos of the Red Sox that she ordered every season. And you can see the tack hole that she put at the top because she would take these pictures and tack them around the cornice of her bedroom so that when the Red Sox were out of town playing, she would listen on the radio and she'd be able to look up and all the players would be looking down at her. So she gave these to me after I got assigned to the baseball beat at Sports Illustrated. It was just such a cherished moment for her to hand these over to me. I still have them, and I haven't tacked them around my cornice, but I do have them carefully put away in the very envelopes that she gave them to me in. So that's the answer to that. My favorite player obviously had to be a Red Sox, and probably Carl Yastrzemski probably has to be it. So there we go. So, well, let's get past the Red Sox because I end up, when I'm at Sports Illustrated and based in New York, spending most of my time around the Yankees. But we'll get to that in a bit. So let me start with the premise that this whole discussion that usually takes place about women and baseball, and with the mention of the access issue that I fought in clubhouses, it's always posed as an issue about nudity and players' sexual privacy, etc. I contend that it was never about nudity, and we're going to walk through a few early examples where there was the exclusion of women by the men of baseball, but it had nothing to do with nudity. So let's walk through it, starting with our wonderful Doris O'Donnell. Doris O'Donnell was a fabulous reporter, extremely competent international reporter, reported out of Russia, reported on the civil rights movement for her paper in Cleveland. But one particular time, her editor thought it would be just fun to send Doris on a road trip with the Cleveland Indians. And that was in 1957. So you can get a sense of what life was like for the lady reporters by the 1944 presentation of the Lovelies who worked in the Cleveland newsroom. And that's Doris O'Donnell in 1946. She does come to Fenway Park in 1957, and she is not permitted to go onto the field. That's why you see her standing next to the field in the grandstands. She was not permitted also to go into the Fenway press box, and she writes about that as part of her coverage of this road trip. Um, and I love her first line of her piece: Boston sports writers are sissies. So she pretty much takes it in stride as the reporter that she was. And then she gets a rather exclusive interview with Ted Williams, who sees her standing there and comes over, rests along the thing, and talks to her for quite some time. And this was at a time where he wasn't talking to the male sports writers, which was a frequent occurrence. So they got rather upset and quote unquote and very jealous of her for this quote access that she had to Ted Williams. Here is the reporting out of the Boston papers with the Hub baseball writers bar the woman reporter from their press box. Ladies, take heed. The baseball press box will remain a male sanctuary, in Boston at least. She went on a 4 game road trip, and the 4 game road trip was an East Coast swing. And in New York and Boston, she was not allowed in the press box. In Baltimore and Washington, she was. So let's see here. Let me get this moving. Okay. Now, this is a later recollection that she gave to a reporter in Cleveland, talking about being thrown out of the two press boxes, told she should be home making babies, and had that one on one interview with Williams. Shortly after her return, she was the subject of a front page story in the Sporting News in which she was quoted as saying of sports writing, "I'd rather see a son of mine driving a bus." O'Donnell's attitude for the entire trip was, "I just wanted my story." That sounds very familiar to me and a number of other reporters who would follow her. One of those being Diane K. Shaw. And once again, we find ourselves at Fenway Park in this little tale of Diane trying to go to cover one series late in the season in 1972. It's something she writes about in her own self-published book, A Farewell to Arms, Legs, and Jockstraps. But also, Roger Angell, at the time of my lawsuit against baseball, wrote in the Sporting Beat a 52-page story in the New Yorker called Sharing the Beat. And in it, he talked at length with Diane K. Shaw. And you can read this as I just briefly tell you that when she called originally to get credentials to cover the game and to be able to talk with the players, she was told that she wouldn't be able to go on the field, just like Doris. She'd be given a seat in the grandstand, and she wouldn't go into the press box. Well, what she did is got her male editor and the male lawyer at the magazine to call Bill Crowley up at Fenway Park. And eventually, Crowley did give her a pass to the field and to the press box. What the men didn't foresee, and Diane, I guess, didn't foresee, is the following. She got up there, but as she walked away from the field, Dick Bresciani, who was the assistant public relations man, Crowley wouldn't even deal with her, took her up to the rooftop, and she was thinking that she was going to go eat her meal up in the dining room, which was on the roof, with the male sports writers. But in fact, she later learned that she couldn't, that the press room was considered a social place for eating and drinking, and no woman was allowed there. So they'd set up what she described as a little ice cream table outside the press room with one chair and one place setting and a little folder that told her it was a ladies' pavilion. And that's where she was supposed to eat. So she later also learned, and Roger Angell talked about, how the people that were actually working in Crowley's office were also treated. They too had the dinners brought down for the gals. They had a little kitchen off the ladies' room where they ate, and Gene Yockey would come in and sit with us. So even the people who were working there for Crowley in his role as the press person for it, um, basically segregated the women from the men. And this woman, Donna Mountain, said it was definitely a man's world in the office. When the Red Sox wives had a fashion show, I sat in on that, planning it a couple times, etc. Anyway, that was the life of that then. So Diane didn't eat her meal that day. She never sat down at that table. And after a few innings, and this is from my book, taking from these various sources, Diane approached Crowley to say hello. And here's the conversation that happened. She said, "See, nothing terrible has happened," Diane said to Crowley, trying to assure him that she could do her job without causing any incident. "Oh, well, it will," he said gruffly. Well, Diane didn't know what he thought, whoops, might happen. "Tomorrow there'll be 50 girls like you here," Crowley contended. Diane had to remind him that in America there weren't close to 50 women who were even sports writers. "Maybe not, but they'll say they are, just so they can get at my players," he shot back. I want to move on now to a year later, and my then colleague at the magazine. I hadn't arrived yet, but she would be my colleague, Stephanie Salter, who at that time had the job that I eventually would get when she left the magazine at the end of 1975, and that was as a reporter researcher for the baseball beat. She, in 1973, was given a ticket by the baseball editor to join them at a table at the winter baseball dinner. And even that, I guess, was as I put the headline here, disrupting tradition, because she was ejected from that dinner between her eating her soup and trying to start eating her fruit plate. She was ejected. Three people came up to her to try to eject her. It was only when the security guard was called that she finally had to leave the Baseball Writers Association dinner. Here is an example of a headline used on Writers Block a Damsel at the Plate. This was a column that was written by one of the writers, Steve Jacobson, who watched all of this happen. You will see here, and just note this because we'll catch up with this later, that around her desk at Sports Illustrated yesterday, they were calling Stephanie Salter Joan of Arc. She had fought a battle of women's liberation against the male sanctuary of the Baseball Writers Association and lost. It wasn't quite like being burned at the stake, but she promised there would be other battles. Those other battles that she thought would be waged on her behalf by the people who had employed her at Sports Illustrated. And she thought this because she had been part of the time in which the women at Time Incorporated, which owned Sports Illustrated, had fought for gender equality, just as the women at Newsweek had done in 1971. The women at Time, there were 136 women who filed a suit against gender discrimination in hiring, promotion, and pay. And that suit had been ended at Time Incorporated when they reached a settlement. Of course, Time Inc., the men at the top of that of our long masthead, refused to say that they had any fault, but they still reached a settlement that agreed that they would treat their women employees as they treated their men. With that in place, Stephanie thought that the least they could do was to fight for her when she had been thrown out of the Baseball Writers Gala. So she wrote a memo, and you can see some of it here. And she says, naturally, I'm anxious to undertake some kind of action. I was doing this during the course of my job, et cetera, et cetera. I sincerely hope that Time Inc. will see fit to support me in this and a subsequent legal case. I am looking forward to your answer. Her memo went upstairs to the man who was put in charge of looking at the enforcement of this discrimination suit that had been resolved in 1971. And so you see here, this is just reminding us that the legal complaint, I guess it was 96 women, I'm sorry, I don't know. Oh, signed between 147 women. Now, what's interesting is that the Sports Illustrated was not well represented in that, and you'll see why in a moment. Mr. Steed was the man who took the memo from Stephanie, and these are all, by the way, confidential documents that we only were able to see because of filing our lawsuit. Once we filed the lawsuit, we had the opportunity to do discovery. And that discovery forced Time Inc. to reveal all documents that had to do with their treatment of women, etc. And those documents suddenly became part of our record, and that's the only reason that I was able to ever see them. So these documents are ones that most people have never seen, and I write about this incident in the book. Mr. Steed writes to Andrea Laguerre, who is the managing editor at Sports Illustrated at the time, attaching Stephanie's memo and saying that he believes it's a fair assumption that Miss Salter might have set out to provoke that Andrea Laguerre writes back to Mr. Steed, who sends him the attached Stephanie memo, and Laguerre says he believes that Miss Salter set out to provoke a political incident and was not at any time concerned with writing a story for Sports Illustrated or otherwise furthering the interests of the magazine. Well, of course she was by being there. No one was going to write a story about the gala, but that's where you network. That's where you meet people. That's what you do. What were the other 9 people from Sports Illustrated doing there. They were doing the same thing she was. That was part of their beat. So Steed writes back and says to Laguerre essentially, in my judgment, some action ought to be taken in order to honor the principle underlying the agreement we made. That's the conciliatory agreement on gender discrimination, to demonstrate that we will back staff members who have been discriminated against. I would suggest that action be taken in the form of dignified protest, etc., to write a letter. So that's his option. Now, you can see here that I've blown this up to show you that Andre Laguerre in that first one basically argued that his own employee, who is a reporter researcher for baseball, is not a member of the baseball staff, and her connection with the sport has been negligible. So you can see him right from the start saying, what these women do for us doesn't matter. They may fact check the stories, they may do reporting for our male writers, but what they are is negligible, and I don't consider them actually a part of our staff. So that was the view. Again, Bob Steed now writes to from Jack Tibby because Andre Laguerre still refuses to write a letter on Stephanie's behalf. So he turns it over to the assistant managing editor, Jack Tibby, who writes to Bob Steed saying that you'll find a draft of a letter, which I imagine should be for Andre's signature, to the chief officer of the Baseball Writers Association. So it is assumed here that a copy of such letter also be presented to Stephanie Salter during the course of the conference you have in mind, etc. We urge that Stephanie also be given a sense of your paragraph 1 as noted by Andre. So they're trying to be conciliatory towards Stephanie, give her a sense that they are supporting her, even though her managing editor behind the scenes doesn't believe that she's even a member of the baseball staff and won't even write the letter that will be signed eventually. You will see eventually that there is a letter written. Jack Tibby wrote it, and it is signed by Andre Laguerre, and it does say that they do not think that the action taken against Stephanie Salter was the correct one to take. This story moves on decades later because Stephanie and I continued to be asked to do interviews about our legendary sports writing back in the 70s. And MSNBC did a story, I believe it was in the, maybe, what was it? Maybe, 2020. And Stephanie and I are both, interviewed. And then I read the story and I discovered that Stephanie still believes that she was supported by Andre Laguerre in the magazine in this action. All these decades later, she is still under the impression that Andre Laguerre supported her all the way through. So I email Stephanie and I say, hey, take a look at these documents, Stephanie. I think they'll change your mind. And so she writes me back and she said, Melissa, I just read what you sent. All of that happened behind my back. I knew zero about what Andre was doing. He was very kind to me and wrote that letter. That's all I ever knew until now. So that's what they intended for her to know. And I wrote back and said, then Stephanie said, I just emailed Cindy and Julianne, those are the people who did the story for MSNBC, suggesting a postscript to the story. It just drives home even harder how uneven and fraught the playing field was for women back then. More papers, Lord, do I want to see who else planned to throw me under the bus. So that's Stephanie. That's her response. Meanwhile, the men have a field day with Stephanie's ouster. Frank True, have we ever heard a better name, writing in Sarasota, decides to explain to people why the incident that happened with Stephanie tells us that discrimination against women is still the right way to go. Today, he writes, discrimination has been adopted as the battle slogan in the war between the sexes in the sports department of journalism. The baseball press box, no woman's land for a century or more, has become an object of conquest. And he describes, just as was described about the gala, why a woman had such fragile ears that she should not be part of an evening that might have a bit of a skit, that might have some dirty language in it. So he writes, now it might be argued that the dialogue in the show could be cleaned up a point where it might be acceptable to feminine ears. But Major League press boxes represent an entirely different situation inasmuch as they are not a one night stand, but they are inhabited throughout the season by uninhibited males who refuse to relinquish their rights. So now we have their rights to be uninhibited against a woman's rights to actually do her job, to express themselves in any language they see fit during the progress of a game. So here's what Stephanie experienced in the progress of a game in her coverage of baseball. She said, during the time of I'm covering the beat, I've been screamed at, called a bitch, addressed as little girl, advised to find a new line of work because, quote, you're trying to do a woman's job in a man's world, whatever that means. I've explained to a black ball player that his vote to bar me from the clubhouse was discrimination. I watched as he smiled and said, you bet it is. And I had been asked by a major league manager if I was still a virgin. Here again, you can read as you see Stephanie again interviewing Tom Seaver and again interviewing him outside of the clubhouse because that's when she was doing her job before my lawsuit. But she talks about when she had gone out to San Francisco and, her time trying to cover the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's. She later says, and I love Stephanie's ability to kind of just sum things up. She says, I specifically use the phrase no girls allowed because it is the overwhelming sentiment of those persons who are most vehement in their denial of equal access. The only thing that separates them from 8-year-old boys who nail a sign to their treehouse is about 20 years. All right, next is when I pointed out Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc rises again. There we are in 1973. And according to Steve Jacobson, everyone at Sports Illustrated is calling Stephanie Salter Joan of Arc. And here we have the headline on Red Smith's column about me in 1978 when he basically just said that my lawsuit was the laughing stock of the season that we had just been through. And so this headline that went out on one of the syndicated columns of Red Smith's published somewhere else in the country said, is she really Joan of Arc? So, that's the question, I guess, the burning question about women. Are they really Joan of Arc? All right, let's get me to Sports Illustrated. Here you see me at my typewriter typing something. Um, when I got to Sports Illustrated, I had come from doing sort of gopher work at ABC Sports. And so I was very disappointed when I finally got hired at SI that the first beat that I was given at the magazine wasn't a sport, but it was the TV radio column. They actually thought I knew something about TV broadcasting. I mean, remember, I'd been a gopher, paid $25 a day to go get coffee for a producer or, sit in the back of a broadcast booth with an announcer. But anyway, I got assigned to the TV radio column. I was upset at first, but it turned out to be fabulous for someone who had never studied journalism, never written a sports story in my life when I got there. It was journalism 101. And the reason is because all of the sources for our stories were located within about 5 blocks of the Time Life building on 6th Avenue. No writer had to ask to take me along on a trip, that involved an airplane and hotels, etc. Bill Leggett, who wrote it, could just say, hey, come with me. We're going to go interview Bob Wussler, or we're going to go over and see Roone Arledge, or we're going to, whatever the story was, he would take me along. So it was like I just learned at his side. And eventually I came to see some stories that he might not have seen as stories. And one of them happened in 1975. This is so now probably almost 2 years after I had started as a reporter researcher. Remember having never written anything in my life. So I go to Bill Leggett and I say, hey, CBS has just hired Phyllis George to be a sportscaster. Isn't this a story? He said, yeah, I think it might be. You go report it and write it. what? So anyway, he was like amazing. He was the best mentor that I could have had. And off I went to report the story and write it. And that was one of my first bylines. 3 years later, I did another story on her when she left the network. And to replace her, CBS interviewed 18 women, all of whom were beauty queens. So I think we began to get the idea of how good looking, beautiful women became the sort of sideline reporters that we've come to know and love. But Phyllis was terrific. I followed her story and actually won the Newswomen's Club of New York front page award for that column in 1978. So I guess it was a good story. I always was longing to get on the baseball beat. And when Stephanie left in 1975, at the end of 1975, I was brought on to that beat, taking her slot as sort of the number two reporter researcher. Baseball was such a huge beat, they needed two reporters. Jim Kaplan was a writer reporter, so he had the sort of senior position among the reporters. But for whatever reason, in the end of 1976, which was my first year on the baseball beat, I was selected to go out and travel with Roger Kahn for 2 weeks on a three-part feature series that he was doing on the old timers in baseball. He was an old timer himself, having been with the Dodgers back in the 1950s. You see him here with Jackie Robinson. But in this case, his job was to go out and talk to those who were still around. Walter Alston with the Dodgers, for example, was still the manager of the Dodgers in 1976, about to retire. Tommy Lasorda was about to take his place. But one of the people that we wanted to go out and spend time with, he wanted to, was Bill Veeck. And so off we went. Bill Veeck owned the Chicago White Sox at the time, so off we went. We get to Kaminsky Park. There's going to be a doubleheader that night. But before we even leave, I forgot that I had this slide to give you a sense of what it was like. I've already brought you into Sports Illustrated, culture with Stephanie Salter's confidential memos. But Roger Kahn goes to the baseball editor to thank him for, giving him a reporter because he needs one to do this story. And he says he goes into the office of the baseball writer and thanks him. And he writes, and this is in the book October Men that came out in 2003. He said, I said thanks. And the editor, well, trying to sort of humor one seldom hears today, said, take her for the whole trip. You can do anything you want with her, just as long as you return her in 2 weeks. Not knowing how to respond, I chose silence. That's from Roger's book, October Men. I never knew any of this until I read the chapter in October Men. When we got to Kaminsky Park, he sent me to get the press passes and we were going to meet and then, go into the press box. And in fact, I ended up in the press box. He was sitting in the front row with Bill Veeck right next to the owner's seat. And I was a couple rows behind. And he mentions in his book, never told me this, that he's sitting there and old time baseball writers variously stared and oogled. One writer came up and said intensely into my ear, your girlfriend doesn't belong here. You know that. What do you think this is? Ladies' night at the Turkish bath. So that was the reception. I came to understand later, as I thought back on it, that I was probably the first woman to go into the press box at Kaminsky Park, and that was the reaction that we got. After the game, we were supposed to meet up with Bill Veeck and just sit and the men were going to drink. I was going to have seltzer and take notes, and we were going to meet in the Bard's room. And so we got to the Bard's room, which is a beautiful sort of was a beautiful old room, working fireplace. They had a bar, a bartender, etc. And you can read on the side that he talks then about how I was received. A few sports writers glared at her and then at me, and though I knew some of them, no one offered even a nod or a friendly look. It was as though I had brought a harlot into the temple, but Melissa was hardly a harlot, and the press room was hardly a temple. So as we were waiting for Veeck, he went up to get drinks, and the bartender informed him that his secretary would have to drink in the hall. In other words, I would have to leave. And Roger got angry, which was good, And he said, she's not my secretary. She's a reporter. If she has to drink in the hall, we'll drink there too. Come on, Melissa, he said to me, we'll drink Mr. Veck's whiskey in the hallway. The next morning, he called Bill Veck and he said, come on, if we're going to do this story, Melissa's going to be there with us and we're going to be in the Bard's room tomorrow night and we're going to talk. And Veck basically tried to get out of it and told Roger, he said, I don't run that room. The sports writers do. And he said, come on, Bill, you own the stadium. Get on it. So the next night I was watching the men drink whiskey till about 2 a.m., drinking my seltzers and taking notes. Here's how Bill Veck felt about my lawsuit and women around. Would I allow women in the clubhouse? Of course not. Would I allow a woman to watch me go to the bathroom? That's what it always came down to. Ignoring the fact, as he well knew, that the bathrooms and the showers were completely separate from the locker room where interviews took place, and not one sports writer, male or female, was allowed to be in the shower bathroom area. So here's an example of what it means for a male, who might have come in with different understanding of what it meant for a woman to be around baseball. I mean, Roger was around baseball when it was all men, but here he saw what I went through. And what you see coming out of that, I think, is very similar to what you see, with the experience of, say, gay marriage, where there was such opposition to it. And once people come to see people in their own lives who are having these relationships, I mean, it's all just part of our culture now. I mean, thank goodness. But here you have it. Roger starts writing about my case when it becomes a national story. One is called A Modest Locker Room, and the other is Attention Bowie Q, News, Not Nudity, is the issue in this suit. So Roger got it. He just had to be around and watch what I was going through, and he understood. So here's my World Series press pass, 1977, and also my press pass to the admission to the New York Yankees, which I had secured by the end of the 1977 season. And then many of you know that it was at the 1977 World Series that Bowie Kuhn found out that I was going to have access to both the Yankees clubhouse because they had given it to me, and the Dodgers because they had taken a vote saying that I could. And so that was when the lawsuit, sort of had it was generated then. There were negotiations that went on when they led to nothing. We ended up in court. This is the court of public opinion on my lawsuit. And you'll see here that Doug Bradford in Detroit even writes about, this is sort of people made sort of they basically suggested that I was using feminine wiles to do my job, whatever that meant. Doug Bradford went so far as to say, I can only wonder if the highly reputable Melissa accepted any of the various invitations, mostly for drinking and carousing, from the Tigers. I received no invitations from any Tigers, but what evidently is pretty upsetting to him is that I was able to do interviews. Again, remember Doris O'Donnell with Ted Williams? In that case, everyone wanted to talk to Mark Fidrich. I think it was mainly because I was a reporter from Sports Illustrated, not that I was a woman, that Mark Fidrich decided that he might want to talk to me because I was in town to do a story. But it was always brought back to the fact that I'm a woman. And that, you look at some of the words he used: wiggled her little finger, sashayed, her super silhouette fading into the sunset. All of this language that I cooed one question after another at him. Again, Peanuts picked it up. Tonight Show with Betty White and Johnny Carson did a skit. O.J. Simpson was hosting Saturday Night Live in February of 1978. So Lorraine Newman joined him in a mock-up locker room to do a skit as well. Oh, okay. Before I go there, I just want to pull out of this for one moment because this morning I got in an email, and this is just kind of moving on the moment. I just want to play for you a very short thing that just gives you a sense of the judge that I talk about and write about in my book. Here was a woman who was the only woman in the history of the Southern District Court when my case was put into a wooden box and she was pulled out to be my attorney. It turns out that with Black History Month, American Experience has done this short on her that I want to play for you.
Known as the Civil Rights Queen, but you've probably never heard of her. Tenacious and unflappable in the face of racism, who was Constance Baker Motley? Hired by Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP, she wrote the original complaint for Brown versus Board of Education, which eventually led to the end of school segregation across the U.S. She was also the first Black woman known to argue before the Supreme Court. She won 9 out of her 10 cases. She got Martin Luther King Jr. out of prison and represented the Freedom Riders and the Birmingham Children Marchers. And after doing all that, was named the first Black female federal judge by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1966. Throughout her career, Baker Motley met racism with complete and total cool. She once ran into opposing counsel in an airport and tried to shake his hand. When the other lawyer rejected it, she just said, "Oh, you still don't shake Black people's hands? Very well then," and went off to board her flight. So yeah, she definitely earned the title of the Civil Rights Queen. For more on the strategist.
Okay, so there we go. I just wanted to share that with you because it just sums up for you, the experience that I had of being in a courtroom with, whoops, let me get ahead here. Um, okay, so here we go. So now we get to sort of where I'm kind of winding down, and this is me doing my actual job. I wanted to start with this incredible quote from Jane Levy, who wrote it about her own experience starting to do sports reporting in the late 1970s. I'll read it because I think it's just so important. When I became a sports writer in 1977, the unstated goal was to write lean, mean, macho prose. We couldn't make ourselves invisible in the locker room, so we tried to make ourselves invisible in our writing. How many times did I dare my friends to remove the byline from my stories and try to find any place where my words sounded as if they were written by a girl? We weren't supposed to acknowledge the differences gender might produce, much less flaunt them. But the truth is, women in the locker room do see things differently, and I don't mean anatomically. We come to sports with different assumptions and experiences. We are outsiders, which is what reporters are supposed to be. The femininity we sought to hide is actually our greatest asset, our X-ray vision. I didn't understand that either. And for a long, long time, and for the first maybe year and a half, 2 years, I tried to follow exactly what the men did. I learned from them. They didn't necessarily know it, but they were my tutors. I followed them around. I listened to how they asked questions. I watched how they conducted themselves around the netting at the back when the batting practice was taking place. I watched their interviews with the manager when he'd come out with the lineup. I saw all of this and I tried to mimic the way they asked questions. I thought that's what women were supposed to do. In the 1970s, what we tried to do more than anything, as Jane points out, is to fit in. And fitting in meant doing it the way that it had always been done. Took me a long time to do it any differently. That long time came when I took Johnny Bench to lunch when he was in town for the All-Star game in 1977. That was in July. And at that lunch, I was picking up on conversations that we had had when I spent time with him with Roger Kahn. In 1976, we went to Cincinnati because the manager there was another one that Roger wanted to talk to, and I ended up talking with Johnny a lot during that time. We picked up on something he was talking about with me then that I found utterly fascinating, and that was what I came to understand was the game within the game, that the catcher has to play with the home plate umpire in order to get that home plate umpire as best he can to make the strike zone fit his pitcher. That's what he's doing. And as far as I could tell, when I went back to the library, a Sports Illustrated library, no one had ever looked at this dimension of the game and what it meant, and what those conversations and what the play was between the home plate umpire and the catchers. So after that lunch, I decided that whenever I went to a ballpark, I would just talk to catchers. And then whenever all the other men were going into the locker room before the game, I would go into the umpire's room. So I just began to, as they say, develop string on this story. And it was utterly fascinating. The umpires were so happy that someone was coming to talk to them about a kind of interesting story as opposed to, challenge a call or something. So I was getting fabulous material. I had tons of tape recordings from those interviews, notebook after notebook. And after the season was over, remember this is 77, so this is coming into the fall when I am also embroiled in this lawsuit at this point, working with lawyers, starting to file the case, etc. On my weekends, I am now in my office transcribing all of those recordings, going through my notebooks, and not telling a single person that I have this idea in mind to possibly write this story. The reason? Because I figured that if I told any editor or anyone else, that they would give this story idea to a male baseball writer to write, and I wasn't willing to give it away. And so I just worked in, myself. I went in, typed my recordings, looked through my notebook, etc. Tried to start typing and learning how to write. I'd never written a feature story before. I had that to sort of try to do. It required a lot of time. And might I add that during this same time, I was also saying that I would get married. So I was starting to plan a wedding. So anyway, long and short of it is that I managed. Oh, and also I was put on the beat, the professional basketball beat over that winter. So I had a lot going on. But this story was so central to me. I so believed in it. I so believed in the relationness, the connectedness between these two people on the field that no one had ever written about. So you'll see that it ends up, I turn it in, and it ends up being the feature story in the baseball issue for 1978, which is on the stands while I am in the courtroom before Judge Motley. And you'll see they hired a cartoonist, an artist to do drawings for it, etc. And it runs at great length. I'm not going to read this because I'm seeing the clock winding down, but it really was just such a joy to work on. And turning it in and then actually hearing that it was going to run was just extraordinary. It was probably the highlight of my career. I'm going to end now with, Judge Motley makes her decision in September of 78. And still, there's argument. Still, there is debate about whether we belong there, whether we even belong doing these jobs. And so in April, I'm no longer with Sports Illustrated. I have left and gone to CBS News, where I've also left. And I'm sort of on my own, but I end up calling the woman sports editor at the New York Times, and she agrees that I will be able to write an op-ed, which is she gives the headline to Locker Rooms Equality with Integrity. I think I could well say with assuredness that it's the only time that the headline equality or equal access or equal rights appeared in a headline about my lawsuit. It was more often with gal, damsel, some kind of pun, a sexual pun. So I write this, and in it, I'll just let you see that the key points I think I made then and wrote was, ever since the question of equal access to locker rooms was raised in October 77, baseball has succeeded brilliantly in making equal access appear as a model, as a moral is what I meant, and not a political problem, and as sexy, but not the sexist issue it is. I and others like me were presented as women who wanted nothing more than to wander aimlessly around a locker room, to stare endlessly at naked athletes, and to invade the privacy of individuals whose privacy has already been disrupted for years by our male colleagues. Nothing could be further from the truth. All I and other female sports writers want is a chance to compete on an equal level with the men. Without access to the locker room, that is not often possible. And then I ended by saying, when the time comes that we no longer read or hear about women in any locker room, and instead turn our attention to reading their stories and listening to their accounts of the game, then we will have reached the goal that I set out for in 1977. So here's my book. I would argue that we're not there yet, but we're approaching it, and I went a little long, but here we go. And let me get back to where am I? Let's see. How do I get out of here? Uh, I want to get us out of the.
There
Wait a
should
minute.
be a stop share at the top of the screen, I think, in your controls.
Stop share. Oh, there it is. Okay, got it. Okay, here we are. Thank you. All right,
Thanks, Amy.
here we are.
I was like, I'm not sure where it is. I know there's a stop share somewhere. That
I'm
was
sorry,
amazing, Melissa.
I couldn't time it out because I just
It's
literally woke up at 8 o'clock this morning and threw that together. So it's longer than I thought it was going to be. But anyway,
but
there's
it but that was amazing because it also helped, I think, put in context, the larger context that this was not a one time. This was not something that was just came out of nowhere, right? That this there's a whole story behind what happened.
yep,
And as there continues to be a story then after 1978, which was the conversation you and I were having the other day about the fact that it sort of gets frozen in this moment of time as if it that's it. And as you pointed out, we've come a long way, but we're not there yet. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, or I will call on people here momentarily. But I was just wanted to ask Melissa, so you have gone on then since 1970 to continue to write in
yes.
all kinds of areas, but a lot of it related to gender issues and children's issues and things like that. Um, did you, after 1978, pretty much put baseball behind you and leave that as far as your primary writing?
Absolutely. Not as my love. I mean, I still love it.
Right,
I took my daughter to Cape Cod Baseball League games from when she was 5 or 6 years old. I still love going to Fenway Park. I can't afford it most of the time. But so I used to go to see the Lowell Spinners until minor league baseball screwed us on all of that. And
right.
just FYI, I mean, which is kind of fun for me, so I'll share it with you all. I have been invited by the Woo Sox, the AAA Red Sox in Worcester, Massachusetts, to come and do their author series on July 25th. So I'll get to talk about
Oh,
my book. But then I throw out the first pitch. So
oh, that's
God help me, okay? I've got to get some training in before then. And the person that I've asked to train me is a woman named Mary Grant, who's the president of the Massachusetts College of Art. Now, why would I ask Mary? Well, Mary, when the College of Art turned 150 years old, was invited to throw the first pitch out at Fenway Park, and she
awesome.
got it over the plate. So I said, Mary, you are now my trainer, you are my coach. And so once the snow melts, we're going to get out there and figure
That's awesome.
how I cannot look like a fool. But
Oh,
yes,
congrats.
baseball
That's
is behind me. I went to Time Magazine for about 10, 11 years, and two things happened there. When I became a correspondent, the managing editor at that time was Ray Cave, who had been at Sports Illustrated when I was there, knew my work well, and he promoted me from being a researcher reporter and had me sent out to LA and assigned me to cover the Olympics in 1984. I was delighted to do it because I had never covered the Olympics when I was at Sports Illustrated. I was looking for new challenges. And I was assigned two athletes to follow going into the Olympics. So when we got to the Olympics, they would know me, I would know them, and it all worked out beautifully. But I was assigned Carl Lewis, who only won 4 gold medals and replicated Jesse Owens' feat from 1936, and Greg Louganis, perhaps the best diver in the history of diving. So, it was just a tiny little assignment. I ended up with the cover story on Time magazine with Carl Lewis when he won the 4 gold medals. But after that, they threw me on the campaign planes with George W. Bush and Geraldine Ferraro, the vice presidential ones. When I finally landed, and I was actually, kind of there and trying to figure out, well, now what stories do I want to cover? You're exactly right. The experience I had had in this lawsuit as a woman made me look at Time magazine and see the legacy there, which was a very patriarchal magazine, still in those times.
yeah.
And I looked at what wasn't being covered, and the answer was women, the women's rights movement, family issues, and children. And so I carved out that beat. And for the next 7 years, I had that beat. They never called me anything. I never got a title. No one ever acknowledged it. But I ended up with incredible number of cover stories, teenage pregnancy, crack babies, you name it. I mean, I had, and I was covering those as weekly issues as well. And so I loved the fact that I was bringing something to that magazine that had never been in the pages before. Every story that had to do with children, I got assigned eventually. People recognized that I was doing this.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
that, the
Yeah.
impact of this lawsuit played out writ large, in
Yeah.
the kinds of coverage that I later went on to do.
Thank you. That's amazing. Amy, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, you already know this. You're the reason that I get to cover sports in the locker room and do what I do. And one of the first questions I still get asked by people when they find out what I do is, "Oh, what is it like to see people naked in the locker room?" So that still hasn't changed. And they're not asking men that when they have, that whatever. But I'm just curious, since we're getting closer to almost 50 years where at least you were involved in this. What does it feel like to look back on? I mean, obviously how far we've come and still how far we have to go.
I would say that we've come a long ways, but not as quickly as I would have hoped back in my days when you're young, you think change can happen easily and quickly. At least you want it to. You believe that you have the energy and the power, and you sort of see this rising up, and you think, well, of course, people will get it now and we'll see change. In fact, it took 40 years at least until the Phyllis George notion on the broadcast side, which of course has become where most people see their sports now and not in print. It took that long to move women from the sidelines up into a broadcast booth. Jessica Mendoza being one of the first, and of course, immediately the criticism was, "Don't have any women's voices out here. I can't stand it. You're ruining my sport. You're ruining everything." This has been the sort of call. It wasn't about nakedness, but it was about the sound of a woman's voice interrupting the purity of the experience for the male. It's almost like, Frank True's article, the uninhibited males have the right to be uninhibited, and it's as though, the men have the right to not hear women, when they're doing their thing with sports, as though women, aren't going to find pleasure in watching these games as well. So, we're not there. Leslie shook her head vigorously. She knows we've talked about this a lot. It's not just in baseball, it's everywhere. And then I want to just draw it out a little to a broader context. I mean, today we are seeing in the digital world, and we're seeing particularly in the AI world, and especially on X and Telegram, we're seeing the facility, the ease with which presumably men can literally take women and disrobe them and turn them into naked sexual objects, which they can then share across the web. So why
Yeah.
would we think, when we're living in an atmosphere where that is a predominant, aspect of digital social media today, that we would, in sports, be making much progress in terms of women? We're living in a sort of very resurgent, misogynistic time. I mean, there can be no question about that when we see the trends that are happening in the newest media that we have. So,
Yeah.
I'm a bit despairing that we're going to make a lot more progress at this time. I don't know. I'd love it if we do. But Amy, you and I have met and talked many times. I hope we continue the conversation. I think these are the topics that we need to bring up. You have a broadcast out there, and I hope you continue to talk about them. Bring people on, bring men into the conversation. This shouldn't just be a conversation of sort of women sharing this outrage with other women. That's fine. We get to,
Absolutely.
but let's
Yeah.
develop the conversation. So I see Jude has her hand up.
Yeah. So I was going to call. Yep. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. I really have so much respect for you, Melissa, for what you've gained for all of us. I worked at Time Inc. I worked in the Time Inc. Sports Library
Woo!
from 1990 to 1993. And I remember we were at a big meeting with Mark Mulvoy, who was the managing editor
Yes.
at that point. And I asked about women's sports, and he said his answer was something like, "Oh, I love women," and just didn't answer the question. I'm like, perfect, perfect response to, by a stupid person who is really not even interested in answering the question, let alone talking about why their coverage of women's sports, other than the swimsuit issue, which has very little to do with actual women's sports. I was so angry at the way that place was run, even though I loved being there because I got to deal with sports material and sports people all day. It was fabulous. But I really wanted to be a sports writer, and I was afraid to do it because I knew the history and I didn't feel strong enough to deal with all that crap. And I'm grateful that you did deal with all that crap and you really changed it. So thank you.
Well, despite dealing with all that crap, let me have a few reactions. First of all, let me let everyone here know that they will surprise no one to learn that Andre Laguerre, the same editor who tumbled around with fooled around with Stephanie Salter's case, was the managing editor who founded the swimsuit issue. And it was that swimsuit issue that turned around the fortunes of Sports Illustrated magazine to such a point that he was viewed as the heroic editor of Sports Illustrated for founding the swimsuit issue. So that let's just kind of put that there. The swimsuit issue lives, by the way, even as much as everything that has happened to Sports Illustrated to diminish it through the years to being almost nothing. Be assured that the swimsuit calendars, the swimsuit T-shirts, and the swimsuit issues survive. So that will give you, some sense of that. I wish you'd taken a shot at it, Jude, and tried to do some writing. It wasn't easy. I probably had maybe 40 stories published with a byline in Sports Illustrated by the time I left. And do you think that I was ever given a shot at being promoted to writer reporter? I mean, never. Never. I wrote more stories in my time as baseball reporter than probably Jim Kaplan did. Jim Kaplan's still a dear friend of mine and a wonderful person and, just a very supportive colleague. But I'm just saying numerically, I wrote more columns and I wrote more stories and I had the feature story, which he never had. And I was never even given a shot at being a writer reporter, which is sort of your next ladder
Yeah.
up to being considered to be a writer. Just wasn't done. And it's no surprise that the women who were the lowest on the editorial line, the writers, the reporter and researchers, like Stephanie Salter, who went out to San Francisco and became both a featured writer and a columnist at the two papers in San Francisco during her time. Jane Gross, who was taken by Newsday as our pro basketball reporter, and she became a lead writer and became the woman who opened the locker rooms in professional basketball coverage. Or Susie Adams, who was the tennis reporter researcher whose job I ended up. When she left, I got hired. Susie Adams left as a reporter researcher at Sports Illustrated and became the editor of World Tennis Magazine. So the way that we were thought of within our own shop was not anything related to our actual value outside of it, because the 70s were a time when every metro newspaper and every magazine was looking for one woman, so that
Yeah.
they would not
So check the box.
be sued by their women if they had one. And so
Yeah.
that was the time where they all went out to get one. And, their pickings were often out of Sports Illustrated because they
Yeah.
valued us more than the people who were our bosses valued us. And
Amazing.
I say
Yeah.
good for those women for leaving, and having those
Yeah.
careers. And that's one reason I left in 1979. You get tired of hitting your head against the wall. I'd
Sure.
always loved. I grew up watching CBS News. God help us what it's become today. But in those days it was Walter Cronkite. And Walter
Right.
Cronkite had ended one of his broadcasts in September of 1978 with my lawsuit, and a story about it. And I'd always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to work someday for CBS News. So I left in 79, and went to CBS News to work. Now, I didn't like TV. I just didn't like it. Didn't have the right feel for me. I was much more comfortable in print, and that's why I returned and came back and went to work for Time Magazine. But
Sure.
I just wasn't going to stay and continue to, have to work 7 days a week to do my real job that I got paid for, and then to go out and do my own reporting, my own writing, my own this, my own that. You know, it was really hard. It was really
Sure.
hard. So,
And I think that that's the overarching message here is to the realization of yes, we've come, but just how far and how far we still have to go. In terms of thinking about all of this. But it wouldn't happen, as Amy pointed out, without people like you, Melissa. And so, all of us owe debts of gratitude to yourself and the others and more that you haven't mentioned, right? That paved the way and
absolutely.
laid the foundation, and know that we still have a long ways to go. Just wanted to quick mention that if you haven't seen there's a lot of things going on in the chat, but Merle mentioned that one of his neighbors is Linda Varigan, who worked
Oh,
at
Linda
Sports
was
Illustrated.
great. Yeah, I knew Linda well. I actually knew Bill well too, Bill Verrigan,
Eh.
both of them very well from those days. So yes, and
And then he mentions Abby Mastracco, who's now the one of the beat writers for the Daily News for the New York Mets,
right.
and which is an example of where we are and the opportunities that are now there that haven't been there in the past.
Before we go too far with that, let
I
us
The start
also
of an opportunity.
let
Yep.
us also take a moment to understand what has happened this week with the Washington
Yes.
Post killing its sports section. Okay,
Yep.
first it was the New York Times who substituted the Athletic for its staff.
Yep.
Now the Washington Post has killed its entire sports section. A few may
Yep.
remain, but they will not be,
Yeah.
covering sports routinely. So let's just take a look. The Washington Post sports section, historically, because of George Solomon, was just the sports section of our time in the 1970s. He was one of the first to vigorously hire women into the sports section. By within like a decade ago, if you were to look at the major four leagues in the Washington, D.C. area, all of them had their beat writers were women. And they had the most amazing sports columnist, Sally Jenkins, arguably in the country. Sally being the daughter of Dan Jenkins, who was my colleague at Sports Illustrated. Sally Jenkins had taken a run through SI later on and also left it, probably for good
Right.
reason. And she bailed on the Washington Post and is now with the Atlantic before the Washington Post killed its sports section. But I think we have to really understand what's happening, again, the larger context.
Sure. Yep.
Take what we're talking about and expand it out. And, when I go and talk with sports journalism classes or even journalism classes, as I did last week at Brookline High School, I had sat and talked and told my story to 45 people who are taking journalism classes and working on the school newspaper at Brookline High School near Boston. And you
Yeah.
look at them and they're so eager and they're so talented today and they have so many tools, and yet where are the jobs, that
Right.
they go to? And particularly when you think about sports writing, I mean, I don't can't name a newspaper that sends sports writers on trips with teams anymore.
Right.
Very
Yeah.
unusual. I think the Globe
Yeah.
might with the Patriots, this year or something like
Mhm.
that. But it's a very changed environment that we're moving into, and women are going to have to fight the fights again, to find their place in a diminished pie.
Well, and I think right there's the key, right? In a diminished pie,
Yep.
because the idea is that you're taking it away from someone else. And so when that pie is diminished, it's going to
Right.
but that's why I think your story and all of this is so important for us, and you all know I'm a historian, so I always look back to it and the importance of understanding how and where and why we can't ignore. And so I think this is a good point at which to thank Melissa for an absolutely wonderful presentation and thoughtful commentary on all of your own experience and others and putting it into such wonderful context and reminding us that we still have a long way to go. And that is absolutely true. So thank you, Melissa. We greatly appreciate it.
Very much for inviting me again, and thanks for sort of forcing me to create a new slide deck. It's always fun to do that because the story becomes a different way of telling it, which is
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so thank you all for coming and joining us. And just a reminder, our next two guests in March and April will be Laura Harai and Sherry Davis. So first Saturdays of each month, come and join us again. So thanks everybody.
all
Stay
right.
well and stay warm. And
Thank you,
we'll
Leslie. Thank you, Melissa. Good night,
Bye.
Dawn.
Thank you.
take care, everybody.
Bye.